3,000 years before Christ walked the earth, before Rome was even a dream, before the pyramids cast their shadows across the desert sands, something extraordinary was happening across our planet. Massive civilizations were rising, thriving, creating wonders that would make even our modern engineers pause in amazement. And then, almost overnight, they simply vanished. Welcome to Bedtime History. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving into one of archaeology's most haunting puzzles. Not just one lost civilization, but an entire network of Bronze Age titans that disappeared so completely, so mysteriously, that for centuries we didn't even know they had existed at all. Picture this: you're standing in what is now Turkey, but it's 3,000 years ago. Around you stretches a city so vast, so sophisticated, that it houses over 50,000 people. Multi-story buildings line carefully planned streets. Advanced metallurgy workshops forge bronze tools and weapons that won't be matched for another 1,000 years. Trade routes stretch from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. This isn't some primitive settlement struggling for survival. This is a superpower. Now imagine returning to that same spot just 200 years later. The city is gone. Not destroyed by war, not buried by volcanic ash, not swept away by floods. Just empty, abandoned. As if an entire civilization simply decided to walk away from everything they had built and disappear into the mist of history. This isn't fiction. This happened. Not once, not twice, but across dozens of sites spanning 3 continents. From the mysterious fortresses of Bronze Age Europe to the vanished cities of the Indus Valley, from the abandoned settlements of ancient China to the ghost towns of the Middle East, an entire chapter of human achievement was erased so thoroughly that we're only now beginning to piece together what we lost. But here's what makes this mystery truly chilling. These weren't isolated incidents. Archaeological evidence suggests that between 1200 and 1000 BCE, there was a synchronized collapse of Bronze Age civilizations across the known world, as if some invisible hand reached down and systematically dismantled the greatest achievements of the ancient world, leaving behind only whispers and shadows. Tonight, we're going to walk through the ruins of these lost titans. We're going to examine the evidence, explore the theories, and try to understand how entire civilizations can simply vanish from history. Because what happened 3,000 years ago wasn't just ancient history. It was a warning, a glimpse into how fragile even the mightiest civilizations can be. And perhaps most unsettling of all, we're going to discover that despite decades of archaeological investigation, despite all our modern technology and scientific methods, we still have no definitive answer for what caused the greatest mystery of the Bronze Age. The Titans are gone, and they took their secrets with them. So settle in, close your eyes, and let your imagination carry you back to a world where giants once walked the earth, where bronze was more precious than gold, and where entire civilizations could disappear without a trace, leaving behind only questions that echo through 3 millennia of silence. Our story begins not with what we know, but with what we discovered we didn't know. For most of human history, scholars believe that civilization began with the Greeks and Romans. Everything before them was considered primitive, barbaric, hardly worth studying. Ancient Egypt was an exception, but only because its monuments were too massive to ignore. The idea that sophisticated civilizations had risen and fallen long before Athens was built seemed impossible. Then, in the late 1800s, everything changed. A German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann became obsessed with Homer's Iliad. Unlike other scholars who treated the epic as pure mythology, Schliemann believed Troy had been a real city. Following clues from the ancient text, he began excavating in Turkey, searching for the ruins of the legendary city that had fallen to Greek trickery and Trojan horses. What he found shook the academic world. Not just one city, but layer upon layer of cities, built one on top of another across thousands of years. Troy wasn't mythology, it was history. And beneath the layers that might have been Homer's Troy, Schliemann found evidence of civilizations that were far older and far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. But Schliemann's discovery was just the beginning. As the 20th century dawned, archaeologists began uncovering similar sites across the globe. In what is now Pakistan and northwest India, they found the remains of vast cities with advanced urban planning, sophisticated drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures. The Indus Valley civilization, as it came to be known, had supported millions of people across an area larger than modern-day Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. In Greece, excavations revealed that long before the classical period, a Bronze Age civilization had built massive palaces, developed a writing system, and established trade networks that spanned the Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans, as they were called, had been the real-world inspiration for the heroes of Homer's epics. In Turkey, archaeologists uncovered the remains of the Hittite Empire, a Bronze Age superpower that had once rivaled Egypt for dominance over the ancient Near East. Their capital, Hattusa, had been surrounded by massive stone walls and filled with temples, palaces, and archives containing thousands of clay tablets written in a previously unknown language. Across Europe, from Britain to the Balkans, evidence emerged of sophisticated Bronze Age cultures that had built impressive monuments, developed complex social structures, and maintained extensive trade networks. The Bronze Age wasn't primitive at all. It had been an era of unprecedented human achievement. But as these discoveries mounted, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Nearly all of these great civilizations shared one terrible similarity. They had come to sudden, mysterious ends. The Mycenaean palaces had burned. The Hittite capital had been abandoned. The great cities of the Indus Valley had been left empty. Across Europe, Bronze Age settlements showed signs of rapid abandonment, often with valuable goods left behind, as if their inhabitants had fled in haste. At first, archaeologists assumed these were isolated incidents, local catastrophes that had struck individual civilizations at different times. Wars, natural disasters, internal strife, these things happened throughout history. But as more sites were excavated and dating techniques improved, a shocking timeline emerged. The collapses hadn't been scattered across centuries. They had happened within the same narrow window of time, roughly between 1200 and 1000 BCE. In archaeological terms, this was essentially simultaneous. Something had caused a synchronized collapse of Bronze Age civilizations across the known world. This realization transformed the study of ancient history. Suddenly, archaeologists weren't just dealing with individual civilizations and their local problems. They were confronting evidence of a global catastrophe, an ancient apocalypse that had erased centuries of human progress and plunged much of the world into what historians now call the Late Bronze Age collapse. The scope of this collapse was staggering. From the Atlantic coasts of Spain and Portugal to the river valleys of Central Asia, from the forests of Northern Europe to the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, Bronze Age settlements showed evidence of abandonment, destruction, or dramatic cultural change during this period. In some cases, the archaeological record shows clear signs of violence: burned buildings, scattered weapons, hasty burials. In others, sites appear to have been simply abandoned, as if their inhabitants had picked up and left without explanation. Most puzzling of all, some civilizations seem to have gradually faded away, their sophisticated technologies and urban centers slowly reverting to simpler, more primitive ways of life. What made this collapse even more mysterious was its selective nature. While some civilizations vanished entirely, others survived and even thrived. Egypt, though weakened, continued to exist. Assyria eventually grew into a mighty empire. But the pattern of survival seemed random, following no obvious geographical, cultural, or technological logic. The Bronze Age titans had fallen, but the cause of their fall remained hidden in the shadows of prehistory. And as archaeologists dug deeper into the mystery, they began to realize that understanding what happened during those crucial centuries wasn't just an academic exercise. It was a window into one of the most fundamental questions about human civilization. How stable are the complex societies we build, and what forces can bring them crashing down? The search for answers would lead scholars down dozens of different paths, each revealing new pieces of the puzzle, but none providing a complete solution. Climate change, natural disasters, invasions, internal rebellions, economic collapse, disease, technological disruption, even extraterrestrial intervention. Every possible explanation has been proposed and debated. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all was that the Bronze Age collapse hadn't been unique. As archaeologists expanded their investigations, they found evidence of similar synchronized collapses at other points in human history. The pattern repeated itself like a dark rhythm pulsing through time, suggesting that the forces that brought down the Bronze Age titans might still be at work in our modern world. The mystery deepens when we consider what these vanished civilizations had achieved. This wasn't just a collapse of primitive societies struggling at the edge of survival. These were sophisticated, technologically advanced cultures that had solved problems we still grapple with today. Take the Indus Valley civilization, for instance. Their cities featured the world's first known urban sanitation systems, with covered drains, public wells, and private bathrooms in houses built of standardized bricks. They had developed a decimal system for weights and measures that was so precise it remained virtually unchanged for over 1,000 years. Their urban planning was so sophisticated that some scholars believe it wouldn't be matched again until the Industrial Age. The Mycenaeans had built palaces with complex bureaucracies that managed vast territories, controlled extensive trade networks, and maintained detailed records using an early form of Greek writing called Linear B. Their engineering skills allowed them to construct massive stone fortifications that still stand today, built with such precision that later Greeks believed they had been constructed by giants. The Hittites had developed iron-working techniques that gave them a military advantage for centuries. They had created one of the world's first legal codes, established diplomatic relations with Egypt that included the world's first known peace treaty, and built a capital city with advanced architectural features including underground tunnels, sophisticated drainage systems, and massive defensive walls. These weren't societies on the brink of collapse due to technological limitations or social instability. They were at the height of their power, the culmination of thousands of years of human development, which makes their sudden disappearance all the more baffling. The evidence suggests that in many cases, these civilizations didn't gradually decline over generations. They collapsed rapidly, sometimes within a single generation. Imagine if New York, London, Tokyo, and Paris were all suddenly abandoned within the span of 50 years, their populations scattered, their technologies forgotten, their languages reduced to undecipherable symbols carved in stone. That's essentially what happened to the Bronze Age world. But here's where the mystery becomes even stranger. In some cases, these civilizations seem to have vanished, not because they were defeated or destroyed, but because they chose to abandon their urban centers and return to simpler ways of life. Archaeological evidence suggests that in many Bronze Age sites, valuable goods were left behind, walls were left intact, and there are no signs of violence or forced evacuation. It's as if the people of these great cities and palaces simply decided that their sophisticated way of life was no longer worth maintaining. They walked away from centuries of accumulated wealth, knowledge, and technological achievement, choosing instead to live in small villages or even as nomads. This pattern of voluntary abandonment challenges our basic assumptions about human nature and social development. We tend to assume that people always want more complexity, more technology, more urbanization. The idea that entire populations would choose to give up the benefits of civilization and return to simpler lives seems counterintuitive. Yet this appears to be exactly what happened in many Bronze Age collapse sites. And this raises profound questions about the nature of civilization itself. What circumstances would cause people to abandon everything their ancestors had built? What pressures could make the benefits of complex society seem like burdens instead? As we delve deeper into this mystery, we'll explore the various theories that scholars have proposed to explain the Bronze Age collapse. We'll examine the evidence for climate change, natural disasters, invasions, and internal social upheaval. We'll look at how these factors might have interacted to create a perfect storm of civilizational breakdown. But we'll also confront a more unsettling possibility, that the collapse of the Bronze Age titans might not have been caused by any single catastrophic event, but rather by the inherent fragility of complex societies themselves. Perhaps what happened 3,000 years ago was not an historical anomaly, but a glimpse into the natural life cycle of human civilizations. The titans of the Bronze Age left behind magnificent ruins, mysterious artifacts, and tantalizing clues about their lives and achievements. But their greatest legacy might be the warning their disappearance carries for our own complex, interconnected world. In trying to understand what happened to them, we might discover something crucial about the forces that shape the rise and fall of all human societies. The mystery of the vanished Bronze Age titans is far from solved. But as we piece together the fragments of their lost world, we begin to see the outlines of a story that is both ancient and urgently modern, both historical and prophetic. The first clue to understanding what happened to these vanished titans lies not in grand theories or sweeping explanations, but in the small details archaeologists find scattered across dig sites like breadcrumbs leading into a dark forest, pottery shards that tell stories of disrupted trade, weapons abandoned mid-battle, granaries filled with grain that was never harvested. Each fragment whispers a piece of the larger mystery. At Pylos, one of the great Mycenaean palace centers in Greece, archaeologists discovered something that still sends chills down their spines. The final linear B tablets found in the palace archives weren't records of tribute or trade deals. They were desperate military dispatches. Send rowers to Pleuron. Watchers are guarding the coast. Why have the bronze smiths not come? The tablets paint a picture of a civilization frantically trying to coordinate its defenses against some unseen threat. But here's what makes these tablets truly haunting. They were baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace, preserving them for posterity. Without that destruction, without that final catastrophe, we would have no record of those desperate final days. The very disaster that ended Mycenaean civilization also gave us our clearest glimpse into how it felt to watch a world come apart. Similar patterns emerge across the ancient world. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital, archaeologists found evidence that the royal archives had been hastily packed, as if someone had tried to save the most important documents before fleeing. But the boxes were never moved. They were found exactly where they had been left, covered by the debris of a collapsed building. In the Indus Valley, the story is different but equally mysterious. There are no signs of violence, no burned buildings, no scattered weapons. Instead, the great cities seem to have been gradually abandoned over several generations. The carefully maintained drainage systems began to fail. The standardized brick sizes became irregular. The sophisticated urban planning gave way to haphazard construction. It's as if the knowledge and organizational capacity that had built these marvels was slowly leaking away, like water from a cracked vessel. But perhaps the most unsettling evidence comes from sites where archaeologists have found layers of ash and destruction followed by nothing. Not immediate rebuilding, not new construction, not even temporary camps. Just empty land that remained uninhabited for decades or even centuries. Places where thriving communities had existed for hundreds of years were suddenly avoided as if they had become cursed. This pattern of abandonment wasn't limited to major urban centers. Bronze Age burial sites across Europe show a dramatic change in practices during the collapse period. Instead of the elaborate grave goods and careful ritual burials that had characterized earlier periods, archaeologists find simple cremations with few or no accompanying artifacts. It's as if the social structures that had supported complex burial rituals had simply evaporated. Even more puzzling, the collapse seems to have affected different aspects of these civilizations in different ways. In some regions, monumental architecture stopped being built, but everyday pottery continued to be made using traditional techniques. In others, writing systems disappeared while metalworking skills persisted. It's as if some kinds of knowledge were more fragile than others, more vulnerable to whatever forces were tearing these societies apart. The archaeological record also reveals something that challenges our assumptions about how civilizations normally collapse. We might expect to see evidence of massive population movements, refugees fleeing disaster zones, or the gradual migration of entire peoples to new territories. But the Bronze Age collapse doesn't show clear patterns of mass migration. Instead, populations seem to have simply vanished into thin air. Where did all these people go? In some regions, the answer appears to be that they didn't go anywhere. They just changed how they lived. Instead of concentrated urban populations, the archaeological record shows scattered small settlements, often built using much simpler construction techniques than their Bronze Age predecessors. It's as if millions of people had collectively decided to abandon city life and return to village-based agriculture. But this explanation raises as many questions as it answers. Why would people who had grown up with the benefits of urban civilization, specialized crafts, long-distance trade, monumental architecture, writing systems, choose to give all of that up? What could have made the complexity of Bronze Age life seem like more of a burden than a benefit? The mystery deepens when we consider the technological losses that accompanied the collapse. Bronze working itself didn't disappear entirely, but the quality and sophistication of bronze artifacts declined dramatically in many regions. More importantly, many of the complex alloys and specialized techniques that had defined Bronze Age metallurgy were lost entirely, not to be rediscovered for centuries. Writing systems suffered even more dramatic losses. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaeans to record their palace bureaucracies, vanished completely. It wouldn't be deciphered by modern scholars until the 1950s, and even then, only because archaeologists had found enough tablets to make statistical analysis possible. For over 3,000 years, the voices of the Mycenaean scribes remained silent, their words as mysterious as if they had been written in an alien language. The Hittite cuneiform archives suffered a similar fate. Although cuneiform writing continued to be used in other parts of the ancient world, the specific forms and vocabulary used by the Hittites were lost when their empire collapsed. Entire libraries of knowledge, legal codes, religious texts, historical records, diplomatic correspondence became unreadable overnight. Perhaps most tragically, the Indus Valley script has never been deciphered at all. Despite thousands of inscriptions found on seals, pottery, and other artifacts, we still have no idea what language these symbols represent or what they say. The voices of one of humanity's earliest urban civilizations remain forever silent. This pattern of knowledge loss suggests that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't just a political or economic crisis. It was an intellectual catastrophe, a massive forgetting that erased centuries of accumulated human wisdom. And unlike the destruction of the Library of Alexandria or other famous losses of knowledge, this wasn't the result of a single catastrophic event. It was a gradual erosion of intellectual capacity that spread across continents over several generations. The scale of this loss becomes clearer when we consider what had to be rebuilt from scratch in the centuries following the collapse. The Greeks of the classical period, for example, had to reinvent writing, borrowing and adapting the alphabet from the Phoenicians. They had to redevelop techniques for monumental stone construction, having lost the engineering knowledge of their Mycenaean predecessors. They had to rebuild trade networks that had once spanned the Mediterranean world. In many ways, the classical civilizations we admire, Greece, Rome, and their contemporaries, were not the culmination of continuous human development, but rather the phoenix that rose from the ashes of an earlier, forgotten golden age. They were rebuilding a world that had been lost, often without even knowing what they were trying to recreate. This realization has profound implications for how we understand human history and the nature of progress itself. We tend to think of civilization as a steady upward climb, with each generation building on the achievements of those who came before. But the Bronze Age collapse reveals a different pattern. Cycles of rise and fall, of advancement and regression, of knowledge gained and knowledge lost. And if this pattern holds true, if human civilizations are inherently unstable and prone to periodic collapse, then the Bronze Age titans were not unique victims of some ancient catastrophe. They were participants in a recurring drama that might be playing out in our own time, with our own technological civilization, our own global networks, our own accumulated wisdom at risk. The evidence from the Bronze Age suggests that complexity itself might be both the greatest strength and the greatest vulnerability of human societies. The same interconnected systems that allowed Bronze Age civilizations to achieve unprecedented heights also made them vulnerable to cascading failures that could bring down entire networks of cities, trade routes, and cultural traditions. As we continue to unravel the mystery of what happened 3,000 years ago, we're not just reconstructing ancient history. We're trying to understand the forces that shape the rise and fall of all human civilizations, including our own. The Titans of the Bronze Age left behind more than ruins and artifacts. They left behind a warning written in the archaeological record about the fragility of the complex worlds we build. And that warning grows more urgent with each passing year as our own global civilization becomes ever more complex, ever more interconnected, and perhaps ever more vulnerable to the same mysterious forces that brought down the giants of the ancient world. The theories that scholars have proposed to explain this catastrophe read like a catalogue of humanity's deepest fears. Natural disasters that could strike without warning. Climate shifts that could starve entire continentizations. Invasions by mysterious peoples who appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Internal rebellions that tore societies apart from within. Each theory has its champions, its evidence, its compelling arguments. But none has emerged as the definitive answer. Perhaps that's because we're looking for a single cause when the truth might be far more complex. The Bronze Age collapse might not have been the result of one catastrophic event, but rather a perfect storm of interconnected crises that fed off each other in ways the ancient world had never experienced before. Let's start with the most dramatic theory, the invasion of the Sea Peoples. Around 1200 BCE, Egyptian records begin mentioning attacks by groups they called the Sea Peoples. These weren't ordinary raiders or neighboring enemies. According to Egyptian inscriptions, they came from the islands and the north, traveling in great fleets with their families, possessions, and livestock. They weren't just raiding, they were migrating, looking for new lands to settle after being driven from their homes by some unknown catastrophe. The Egyptians managed to defeat these invaders in a series of naval and land battles, but their records suggest that other regions weren't so fortunate. The Sea Peoples are mentioned in connection with the destruction of cities across the eastern Mediterranean. They may have been responsible for burning Troy, sacking Mycenaean palaces, and contributing to the fall of the Hittite Empire. But who were these Sea Peoples? The Egyptian records give them names: the Peliset, the Sherdan, the Luca. But these names don't correspond clearly to any known civilizations. Some scholars have tried to connect them to later peoples. The Peliset might have been the Philistines. The Sherdan might have been from Sardinia. But these connections remain speculative. More puzzling still is the question of where they came from and what had driven them to migrate in the first place. If they were refugees from the Bronze Age collapse, then they were both cause and effect of the catastrophe. Something had destroyed their original homelands, forcing them to become destroyers themselves. This leads us to the second major theory, climate change. Around 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean world experienced a significant shift in climate patterns. Evidence from ice cores, tree rings, and ancient pollen samples suggests that the region became cooler and drier. Rainfall decreased, growing seasons shortened, and agricultural productivity declined across much of the Bronze Age world. For civilizations that had grown accustomed to reliable harvests and stable food supplies, this climate shift could have been devastating. Crop failures would have led to famine, which would have triggered social unrest, population movements, and conflicts over remaining resources. Weakened by hunger and internal strife, even the mightiest Bronze Age kingdoms would have been vulnerable to invasion or internal collapse. The climate theory is particularly compelling because it could explain the synchronized nature of the Bronze Age collapse. A regional climate shift would have affected all the civilizations in the area simultaneously, creating cascading crises that spread from one society to another through their interconnected trade networks. But climate change alone might not be sufficient to explain the complete collapse of so many sophisticated civilizations. After all, human societies had survived climate shifts before. The Bronze Age peoples were skilled farmers and traders who had adapted to environmental challenges for centuries. Why would this particular climate change prove so catastrophic? The answer might lie in the third major theory, systems collapse. By 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world had become more interconnected than ever before. Trade networks linked civilizations from Spain to Central Asia. Diplomatic relations bound kingdoms together in complex webs of alliance and obligation. Specialized production meant that individual regions depended on imports for essential materials: tin from distant mines, amber from northern forests, ivory from African elephants. This interconnectedness was a source of tremendous strength, allowing Bronze Age civilizations to achieve unprecedented levels of sophistication and wealth. But it also created vulnerabilities that earlier, more isolated societies hadn't faced. When one link in the network failed, the effects could ripple across the entire system. Imagine if climate change disrupted agriculture in one region, forcing local rulers to redirect trade goods that had previously been exported to other areas. This would create shortages in distant lands, potentially triggering social unrest or military conflicts there. Those conflicts might disrupt other trade routes, creating a cascade of failures that could bring down the entire network. This systems collapse theory helps explain why the Bronze Age collapse was so thorough and so difficult to recover from. It wasn't just individual civilizations failing, it was the entire interconnected world system breaking down. Without the network that had supported their sophisticated economies and technologies, even surviving communities would have been forced to simplify their way of life dramatically. But perhaps the most unsettling theory is the one that suggests the collapse was, at least partially, voluntary. Archaeological evidence from some Bronze Age sites suggests that people didn't flee in panic or die in catastrophes. Instead, they seem to have made deliberate choices to abandon their complex urban centers and adopt simpler ways of life. They left behind valuable goods, sophisticated technologies, and centuries of accumulated knowledge, choosing instead to live in small villages or as pastoral nomads. This pattern is particularly clear in the Indus Valley, where the great cities weren't destroyed by violence, but were gradually abandoned over several generations. People stopped maintaining the sophisticated urban infrastructure, stopped following the standardized weights and measures, stopped building according to the careful urban plans that had characterized the civilization for 1,000 years. Why would people make such choices? One possibility is that the costs of maintaining complex Bronze Age societies had begun to outweigh the benefits. Perhaps the elaborate bureaucracies, the monumental construction projects, the military campaigns, and the specialized production systems had become too burdensome to sustain. Modern research on social complexity suggests that as societies become more sophisticated, they require increasing amounts of energy and resources just to maintain their basic functions. Eventually, they may reach a point of diminishing returns, where additional complexity creates more problems than it solves. If Bronze Age civilizations had reached this point of diminishing returns, then climate change, invasions, or other external pressures might have simply provided the final push toward collapse. People who were already struggling under the weight of complex social systems might have welcomed the opportunity to simplify their lives. even if it meant giving up the material benefits of urban civilization. This voluntary simplification theory is disturbing because it suggests that the collapse of complex societies might be, in some sense, inevitable. If the costs of complexity always tend to increase over time, while the benefits level off or decline, then every civilization might eventually reach a point where collapse becomes preferable to continued complexity. But perhaps we're overthinking this mystery. Perhaps the Bronze Age collapse was simply the result of a unique combination of unfortunate circumstances that will never be repeated. Or perhaps it was caused by factors that we haven't even considered yet. Some researchers have proposed more exotic theories: massive volcanic eruptions that disrupted climate patterns across the globe, pandemic diseases that spread along the same trade routes that had once carried prosperity, even asteroid impacts or solar storms that could have affected agriculture and navigation simultaneously. Each of these theories has some supporting evidence, but none provides a complete explanation for the scope and timing of the Bronze Age collapse. The truth might be that we're dealing with a combination of factors so complex that it defies simple explanation. Or perhaps the mystery goes even deeper. Perhaps the Bronze Age collapse reveals something fundamental about the nature of human civilization itself, something that makes complex societies inherently unstable over long periods of time. If that's the case, then the Titans of the Bronze Age weren't victims of a unique historical catastrophe. They were participants in a pattern that repeats throughout human history, a cycle of rise and fall that might be as natural and inevitable as the seasons themselves. As we continue to search for answers, we're not just trying to solve an ancient puzzle. We're trying to understand the forces that shape all human societies, including our own. The Bronze Age Titans fell 3,000 years ago, but their collapse might hold lessons that are more relevant today than ever before. In our interconnected, globally integrated world, we face many of the same vulnerabilities that brought down the Bronze Age civilizations. We depend on complex trade networks, specialized production, and sophisticated technologies that could be disrupted by climate change, natural disasters, or social upheaval. The mystery of the vanished Bronze Age Titans isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror that reflects our own potential future, a warning about the fragility of the complex world we've built, and a challenge to understand the forces that could either sustain our civilization or bring it crashing down just as completely as those ancient giants who once seemed invincible. The whispers of the Bronze Age collapse grow louder when we realize that this wasn't humanity's first encounter with civilizational annihilation. As archaeologists have expanded their investigations beyond the Mediterranean world, they've uncovered evidence of similar synchronized collapses at other points in our species' journey. The pattern repeats like a dark heartbeat pulsing through time, suggesting that what happened 3,000 years ago might not have been an anomaly, but rather a glimpse into the natural rhythm of human societies. Around 2200 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the Bronze Age collapse we've been examining, another wave of destruction swept across the ancient world. The Akkadian Empire, which had been the first true multi-ethnic empire in human history, suddenly disintegrated. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom collapsed, ending the age of pyramid building and plunging the land of the pharaohs into chaos. The Indus Valley civilization began its slow decline. From Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, from the Nile to the Ganges, urban centers were abandoned and complex societies simplified. But the pattern stretches even further back. Around 3200 BCE, archaeological evidence suggests another period of widespread social upheaval. And if we look forward from the Bronze Age collapse, we find similar synchronized breakdowns occurring roughly every 8 to 12 centuries. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, the collapse of the Maya civilization around 900 CE, each followed by periods of simplification, knowledge loss, and gradual rebuilding. It's as if human civilization operates on some kind of invisible cycle, building complexity for centuries, only to see it all come crashing down in a relatively brief period of chaos and transformation. The Bronze Age Titans weren't unique victims. They were participants in a recurring drama that might be as fundamental to human society as birth, growth, and death are to individual organisms. This cyclical view of history challenges everything we've been taught about progress and development. We like to imagine that human civilization follows an upward trajectory, that each generation builds upon the achievements of the last, that knowledge and technology always accumulate over time. But the archaeological record tells a different story. It shows us that complexity and simplicity, advancement and regression, creation and destruction are locked in an eternal dance. The implications are staggering. If civilizational collapse is indeed cyclical, then every society that reaches a certain level of complexity becomes vulnerable to forces that earlier, simpler societies could easily survive. The very achievements that make a civilization great, its cities, its trade networks, its technologies, its specialized knowledge, also make it fragile. Consider the Bronze Age world at its height. Never before had human societies achieved such levels of sophistication. Never before had so many people lived in cities, depended on long-distance trade, or specialized in narrow economic roles. Never before had knowledge been so concentrated in the hands of literate elites who maintained vast archives and complex bureaucracies. But this sophistication came with a price. When Bronze Age farmers needed metal tools, they couldn't make them locally. They had to rely on specialized smiths who depended on imported tin and copper. When Bronze Age rulers needed to communicate across their territories, they couldn't rely on oral tradition. They had to maintain schools of scribes who could read and write complex scripts. When Bronze Age cities needed food, they couldn't rely on nearby fields. They had to coordinate agricultural production across vast regions and maintain extensive distribution networks. Each of these dependencies created a potential point of failure. If the tin trade was disrupted, tools became scarce. If the scribal schools were destroyed, administrative knowledge was lost. If the agricultural networks broke down, cities starved. The more sophisticated Bronze Age societies became, the more vulnerable they grew to cascading failures that could bring down the entire system. Modern complexity theory has a name for this phenomenon: normal accidents. These are failures that occur not because of any single catastrophic event, but because complex systems inevitably develop unexpected interactions between their components. In tightly coupled, highly complex systems, small failures can propagate and amplify until they cause system-wide collapse. The Bronze Age world, with its intricate networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, may have been the first human system complex enough to experience this kind of normal accident. A crop failure in one region could disrupt trade routes, which could destabilize political alliances, which could trigger military conflicts, which could destroy more trade routes, creating a feedback loop that spiraled out of control faster than any individual society could respond. But if this analysis is correct, it raises disturbing questions about our own civilization. Modern industrial society is far more complex and tightly coupled than anything the Bronze Age world achieved. Our global economy depends on supply chains that span continents. Our technologies require materials and expertise from dozens of countries. Our cities depend on electrical grids, water systems, and food distribution networks that could be disrupted by failures thousands of miles away. We've built a civilization that is more sophisticated, more powerful, and more capable than any previous human society. But we've also built one that might be more vulnerable to cascading failures than the Bronze Age world ever was. The same global connectivity that allows us to coordinate responses to crises also ensures that local disruptions can spread worldwide in a matter of hours or days. The Bronze Age collapse took decades or even centuries to fully unfold. In our hyper-connected world, a similar systemic failure might happen much faster. Financial contagion can circle the globe in minutes. Computer viruses can shut down critical infrastructure in hours. Social unrest can spread through social media faster than authorities can respond. Yet there's another aspect to the cyclical theory that offers a different perspective on these patterns of collapse and renewal. Each period of breakdown has also been followed by periods of innovation and rebirth. The collapse of the Bronze Age world was followed by the Iron Age, which saw the development of new technologies, new forms of government, new philosophical and religious traditions. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was followed by the medieval period, which, despite its reputation as a dark age, saw tremendous innovations in agriculture, architecture, and scholarship. The Maya collapse was followed by cultural renaissance in other parts of Mesoamerica. Each collapse cleared away old systems that had become rigid and inefficient, making room for new forms of organization to emerge. Perhaps this is the true lesson of the Bronze Age Titans. Their collapse wasn't just a tragedy, it was also a transformation. The destruction of the old world made possible the creation of the new. The simplification that followed the collapse allowed societies to experiment with different approaches, to rediscover forgotten knowledge, to develop new solutions to old problems. From this perspective, the cyclical nature of civilizational collapse isn't a bug in the system of human development. It's a feature. Just as forests need periodic fires to clear away dead undergrowth and allow new growth to flourish, human societies might need periodic collapses to clear away accumulated inefficiencies and allow for innovation and renewal. But this optimistic interpretation comes with a crucial caveat. Previous collapses, devastating as they were for the people who lived through them, never threatened the survival of human civilization as a whole. There were always other societies that survived, preserved knowledge, and eventually rebuilt. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed many great civilizations, but it didn't destroy all of them. Egypt survived, weakened but intact. New societies emerged from the ruins of the old. Today, for the first time in human history, we have a truly global civilization. If our complex systems experience a Bronze Age-style collapse, there might be nowhere to run, no isolated societies to preserve knowledge and eventually rebuild. The next collapse might be the last collapse, the end of the human experiment in complex civilization. This realization adds urgency to our study of the Bronze Age mystery. We're not just trying to understand what happened to some ancient societies. We're trying to understand the fundamental dynamics of civilizational collapse so that we might be able to prevent it, or at least prepare for it. The Bronze Age Titans left behind more than ruins and artifacts. They left behind a warning, encoded in the archaeological record, about the price of complexity and the fragility of the systems we build. Their collapse was a dress rehearsal for challenges we might face in our own time. But they also left behind evidence of human resilience, of our species' remarkable ability to adapt, survive, and rebuild, even after the most devastating losses. The people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse didn't just disappear. They simplified their lives, preserved what knowledge they could, and eventually laid the foundations for new civilizations that surpassed even the achievements of their predecessors. In trying to solve the mystery of the vanished Bronze Age Titans, we're really trying to answer a question that has haunted humanity since we first began building complex societies. How do we create systems that are sophisticated enough to give us the benefits of civilization, but resilient enough to survive the inevitable shocks that complex systems must endure? The answer to that question might determine whether our own civilization joins the Bronze Age Titans in the archaeological record, or whether we become the first human society to break the cycle of rise and fall that has defined our species' relationship with complexity. As we delve deeper into this ancient mystery, we're not just archaeologists excavating the past. We're detectives working on a case that's still unfolding, trying to solve a crime that might not yet be finished. The evidence points in many directions. The theories multiply with each new discovery, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The Bronze Age Titans are gone, but their story isn't over. It continues in every city we build, every network we create, every system we design. Their collapse echoes through time, a warning from the deep past about forces that are still at work in our world. And somewhere in the ruins they left behind, in the patterns of their rise and fall, in the mystery of their disappearance, lies a key to understanding not just what happened to them, but what might happen to us. The Titans may have vanished, but their greatest secret, the secret of how civilizations live and die, remains hidden in the shadows of history, waiting to be discovered before it's too late to matter. The deeper we dig into the Bronze Age mystery, the more we realize that perhaps we've been asking the wrong questions all along. Instead of focusing on what destroyed these civilizations, maybe we should be asking what made them so vulnerable in the first place. And the answer to that question might lie not in external catastrophes, but in the very nature of how these societies organize themselves. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed something that challenges everything we thought we knew about Bronze Age social structures. These weren't just collections of farmers and craftsmen living under the protection of warrior kings. They were incredibly specialized societies where individual communities might focus on a single aspect of production. One valley making nothing but pottery, another devoted entirely to metalworking, a third specializing in textile production. This extreme specialization allowed Bronze Age civilizations to achieve remarkable efficiency and quality in their products. A Bronze Age sword wasn't just hammered out by the local blacksmith. The copper might come from mines in Cyprus, the tin from deposits in Cornwall or Bohemia. The ore would be smelted by specialists who had spent decades perfecting their techniques. The metal would be shaped by master smiths whose families had passed down secrets for generations. The finished weapon would be decorated by artisans who knew every traditional pattern and symbol. The result was a bronze sword that was not just a tool, but a work of art, a technological marvel that represented the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization. But this same specialization created dependencies that earlier societies had never experienced. Imagine you're a Bronze Age ruler trying to equip your army. You can't just tell your people to make weapons. You need copper from one region, tin from another, charcoal from a third. You need specialists who know how to smelt the ore, smiths who know how to work the metal, traders who can coordinate the movement of materials across hundreds of miles. If any link in this chain breaks, your entire military capability collapses. This vulnerability extended to every aspect of Bronze Age life. Food production depended on networks of farms, storage facilities, and distribution systems that could feed cities of tens of thousands of people. Administrative systems required scribes who could read and write, messengers who could carry orders across vast territories, and record keepers who could track the movement of goods and people. Religious practices relied on trained priests, imported materials for sacrifices, and pilgrims traveling from distant lands. Each of these systems was a marvel of human organization, but together they created a web of interdependence that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Bronze Age civilizations weren't just complex, they were hyper-complex, with every component dependent on every other component in ways that even their own leaders probably didn't fully understand. And here's where the mystery deepens. Archaeological evidence suggests that Bronze Age societies were aware of their vulnerabilities. They built massive storage facilities to guard against crop failures. They maintained standing armies to protect against invasions. They developed diplomatic protocols to prevent conflicts with neighboring powers. They even created backup systems, alternative trade routes, redundant administrative centers, multiple sources for critical materials. But their preparations seem to have focused on obvious, immediate threats. They were ready for wars, famines, and natural disasters. What they weren't prepared for was the possibility that their entire system of civilization could simply stop working, not because of any single catastrophe, but because the interconnected web of dependencies had become too complex to maintain. This is where modern network theory provides some disturbing insights. Complex networks, whether they're computer systems, electrical grids, or ancient trade routes, all share certain characteristics. They're incredibly robust against random failures. You can knock out individual nodes without affecting the overall system. But they're surprisingly vulnerable to cascading failures that spread through the network's most connected hubs. In the Bronze Age world, certain cities and regions served as crucial hubs in the network of civilization. Places like Ugarit in Syria weren't just wealthy trading centers. They were critical nodes that connected multiple trade routes, cultural traditions, and political systems. When these hubs failed, the effects rippled outward through every connection they maintained. But the archaeological record suggests something even more puzzling. In many cases, these critical hubs weren't destroyed by external enemies. They were abandoned by their own inhabitants. People walked away from cities that had been built over centuries, leaving behind wealth, technology, and irreplaceable cultural knowledge. Why would people abandon the centers of their own civilization? One possibility is that maintaining these complex urban centers had become too burdensome. The administrative overhead, the resource requirements, the social tensions created by extreme inequality, perhaps the costs of Bronze Age complexity had begun to outweigh the benefits. This theory gains support when we look at what happened after the collapse. In many regions, people didn't disappear. They simplified. Instead of living in large urban centers with specialized roles, they formed smaller communities where individuals could perform multiple functions. Instead of depending on long-distance trade, they focused on local production. Instead of maintaining complex administrative systems, they relied on personal relationships and oral traditions. From one perspective, this looks like regression, a fall from the heights of Bronze Age achievement to primitive subsistence living. But from another perspective, it might represent a rational adaptation to changing circumstances. If the complex systems of Bronze Age civilization had become too fragile to maintain, then simplification wasn't just a consequence of collapse, it was a survival strategy. This interpretation is supported by evidence that many post-collapse communities actually developed new technologies and social innovations. They couldn't make bronze as skillfully as their predecessors, but they learned to work iron more effectively. They couldn't maintain vast trade networks, but they developed more resilient local economies. They couldn't build monumental architecture, but they created more sustainable settlement patterns. Perhaps the Bronze Age collapse wasn't a catastrophic failure of human civilization. Perhaps it was an adaptive response to systems that had become too complex to sustain. The people who lived through it weren't victims. They were survivors who chose to sacrifice sophistication for resilience, complexity for stability. But this raises an even more disturbing question about our own time. Modern industrial civilization is orders of magnitude more complex than anything the Bronze Age world achieved. Our supply chains are longer, our specializations more extreme, our dependencies more numerous. We've built a global system that can deliver fresh fruit from Chile to supermarkets in Alaska, that can coordinate manufacturing processes across dozens of countries, that can move information around the world in milliseconds. This system has given us unprecedented prosperity, longer lifespans, and capabilities that would seem magical to Bronze Age observers. But it has also created vulnerabilities that Bronze Age societies never faced. A computer virus can shut down power grids. A pandemic can disrupt global supply chains. A financial crisis in one country can trigger recessions on the opposite side of the world. We've become so specialized that most of us have no idea how to produce the basic necessities of life. We depend on systems so complex that even experts understand only small pieces of the whole. We've created a civilization that works brilliantly when everything goes right, but might collapse catastrophically when things go wrong. The Bronze Age Titans faced a similar choice 3,000 years ago. They could try to maintain their complex systems despite mounting evidence that those systems were becoming unsustainable. Or they could choose to simplify before circumstances forced simplification upon them. The archaeological evidence suggests that many chose simplification. They abandoned their cities, their technologies, their specialized knowledge, not because they were conquered or destroyed, but because they recognized that complexity had become a trap rather than a tool. Today, we face similar pressures. Climate change threatens the environmental stability that our agricultural systems depend on. Resource depletion challenges the material foundations of industrial production. Social inequality strains the political systems that hold our societies together. Technological change accelerates faster than our ability to understand its consequences. Like the Bronze Age rulers who tried to maintain their complex systems against mounting challenges, we're investing enormous resources in trying to manage these problems without fundamentally changing how our civilization works. We're building seawalls instead of moving away from rising seas. We're developing new technologies to extract resources instead of learning to use less. We're creating more complex financial instruments instead of simplifying economic relationships. But the Bronze Age collapse suggests that there might come a point where these adaptive strategies are no longer sufficient. There might come a moment when the choice is between voluntary simplification and involuntary collapse. The difference is that voluntary simplification can be planned, gradual, and humane. People can choose which aspects of complexity to preserve and which to abandon. They can maintain the benefits of civilization while reducing its vulnerabilities. They can build resilience without sacrificing everything that makes life worth living. Involuntary collapse, by contrast, is chaotic, destructive, and often catastrophic for the people who experience it. When complex systems fail suddenly, they take with them not just their sophisticated capabilities, but often the basic infrastructure that people depend on for survival. The Bronze Age titans left us more than archaeological puzzles. They left us a case study in how complex civilizations respond to systemic stress. Some fought to maintain their systems until those systems destroyed them. Others chose to adapt, to simplify, to build new forms of organization that were better suited to changing circumstances. The survivors weren't the ones with the biggest cities or the most sophisticated technologies. They were the ones who recognized when change was necessary and had the wisdom to choose their own path rather than have it chosen for them. As we stand at our own crossroads, facing our own systemic challenges, the lesson of the Bronze Age collapse becomes clear. Complexity is not an end in itself. It's a tool, and like any tool, it's only valuable as long as it serves our purposes. When complexity becomes a burden rather than a benefit, when it creates more problems than it solves, when it makes us more vulnerable rather than more capable, then it's time to consider a different approach. The Bronze Age titans discovered this truth too late. They clung to their complex systems even as those systems were failing them. By the time they were ready to adapt, adaptation was no longer possible. The choice had been taken away from them. We still have that choice. We can learn from their example, recognize the warning signs, and begin the process of building more resilient forms of organization before crisis forces change upon us. Or we can follow their path, maintaining our complex systems until they collapse under their own weight, leaving future archaeologists to puzzle over the ruins of our own vanished civilization. The mystery of the Bronze Age collapse isn't just about what happened 3,000 years ago. It's about what might happen tomorrow, and whether we're wise enough to learn from the past before we're condemned to repeat it. The Titans fell because they couldn't let go of what they had built, even when holding on meant destroying everything. The question that haunts us across the millennia is simple. Will we be any wiser? As we stand in the ruins of Knossos today, walking through the reconstructed corridors of what was once the heart of Minoan civilization, it's almost impossible to imagine that this palace complex was abandoned so completely that its very existence was forgotten for over 3,000 years. The Minoans had created something unprecedented, a Bronze Age society that seemed to thrive without massive defensive walls, without obvious signs of a warrior culture, without the militaristic monuments that defined most ancient civilizations. Their art depicted dolphins leaping through azure waters, elegant court ladies with elaborate hairstyles, athletes vaulting over charging bulls. Their cities were connected by paved roads that ran across the mountainous landscape of Crete like ribbons of stone. Their ships carried goods across the Mediterranean, establishing trade relationships that stretched from Egypt to Sicily. They had developed a complex writing system, built multi-story palaces with sophisticated plumbing, and created a culture that seemed to celebrate life rather than death. And then, around 1450 BCE, it all ended. The great palaces were burned. The writing system disappeared so completely that we still can't fully decipher it. The trade networks collapsed. The artistic traditions vanished. Within a single generation, one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world had become a memory. And eventually, not even that. But the Minoan collapse reveals something that makes the Bronze Age mystery even more perplexing. This wasn't a civilization that fell because it was weak or primitive. The Minoans had survived for over 500 years, weathering earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and the rise and fall of dynasties across the ancient world. They had rebuilt their palaces multiple times, each iteration more magnificent than the last. They had adapted to changing trade conditions, political upheavals, and natural disasters with remarkable resilience. Yet something about the crisis that struck around 1450 BCE was different. Something that their accumulated wisdom, their sophisticated technology, their extensive trade networks couldn't overcome. The question is, what could destroy a civilization that had proven so adaptable, so resilient, so successful at navigating the challenges of the Bronze Age world? The answer might lie in a pattern that archaeologists have begun to recognize across multiple Bronze Age collapse sites. These civilizations didn't fail because they were unable to solve individual problems. They failed because they were unable to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Each crisis they faced might have been manageable in isolation, but together they created a cascade of failures that overwhelmed even the most sophisticated societies. Take the Mycenaeans, whose massive stone fortifications still tower over the Greek landscape like monuments to paranoia. These weren't the works of a confident civilization. They were the desperate constructions of a society that knew it was under threat. The later Mycenaean palaces were surrounded by walls so thick that later Greeks believed they had been built by giants. The entrances were designed as death traps, with multiple gates and narrow passages where attackers could be slaughtered. Even the water supplies were fortified, with secret tunnels leading to protected springs. But despite all these preparations, despite centuries of military experience and sophisticated defensive technology, the Mycenaeans fell. Their palaces burned, their administrative systems collapsed, their writing disappeared. Within a few generations, the people who had inspired Homer's epic tales of heroic warfare had become illiterate farmers living in simple villages. The Mycenaean collapse reveals another crucial aspect of the Bronze Age mystery: the role of what we might call civilizational amnesia. It wasn't just that complex technologies were lost when these societies collapsed. It was that the knowledge of how to rebuild them disappeared as well. The later Greeks could see the massive walls of Mycenaean fortresses, but they had no idea how such structures had been constructed. They could find fragments of linear bead tablets, but they couldn't read them. They remembered stories of great heroes and mighty kingdoms, but they had lost the practical knowledge that had made those achievements possible. This pattern of knowledge loss suggests that Bronze Age civilizations had developed a form of cultural memory that was both remarkably sophisticated and surprisingly fragile. They had created systems for preserving and transmitting complex information, writing systems, educational institutions, professional guilds, religious traditions. But these systems depended on continuity, on unbroken chains of transmission from one generation to the next. When the Bronze Age collapse disrupted these chains of transmission, entire categories of knowledge vanished permanently. It wasn't just that people forgot how to make bronze or build palaces. They forgot that such knowledge had ever existed. The collapse erased not just achievements, but the memory of achievements, creating a kind of cultural dark age that lasted for centuries. This helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the post-collapse period: how long it took for new civilizations to rediscover technologies and techniques that had been common knowledge during the Bronze Age. The classical Greeks didn't just rebuild civilization from scratch. They had to reinvent it, often without realizing they were recreating things that had existed before. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery about Bronze Age civilizations is how modern they seem in their final phases. As archaeologists have developed more sophisticated techniques for analyzing ancient sites, they've uncovered evidence of problems that sound remarkably familiar to contemporary observers. Urban overcrowding had become a serious issue in many Bronze Age cities. Palace administrators struggled with complex bureaucracies that had grown too large and unwieldy to manage effectively. Trade imbalances created economic instability, as some regions became dependent on imports they couldn't always afford. Environmental degradation, deforestation, soil erosion, salinization of agricultural land had begun to undermine the agricultural systems that supported urban populations. Social inequality had reached extreme levels, with palace elites accumulating wealth while common people struggled with increasing economic pressures. Political systems had become rigid and unresponsive, unable to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Religious institutions had grown powerful and conservative, resistant to innovations that might threaten their authority. These sound like contemporary problems because they are contemporary problems. The Bronze Age titans were grappling with many of the same challenges that face modern industrial societies. The difference is that we have the benefit of their example, the warning written in the archaeological record about what happens when these problems are allowed to compound and interact without effective solutions. Yet even with this knowledge, even with our advanced understanding of complex systems and social dynamics, we continue to struggle with remarkably similar issues. Our cities grow more crowded and expensive. Our bureaucracies become more complex and inefficient. Our economic systems create greater inequality. Our political institutions resist necessary reforms. Our environmental problems multiply faster than our ability to solve them. The parallel is so striking that some scholars have begun to wonder whether we're looking at the same fundamental processes at work. Perhaps there are natural limits to how complex human societies can become before they begin to generate problems faster than they can solve them. Perhaps what happened to the Bronze Age titans wasn't a unique historical catastrophe, but rather a glimpse into the natural life cycle of complex civilizations. This possibility becomes even more disturbing when we consider the global nature of modern civilization. The Bronze Age world consisted of many separate societies, connected by trade networks and cultural exchange, but still fundamentally independent. When some of them collapsed, others survived to carry on human development. Egypt endured, weakened, but intact. Mesopotamian civilizations continued to evolve. New societies emerged from the chaos to eventually rebuild and surpass what had been lost. Today, for the first time in human history, we have created a truly global civilization. Our economic systems are interconnected across all continents. Our communication networks span the entire planet. Our environmental problems affect every region. Our cultural influences spread worldwide within hours or days. This global integration has brought tremendous benefits, unprecedented prosperity, rapid technological advancement, the ability to coordinate responses to global challenges. But it has also created a vulnerability that no previous civilization has ever faced. If our complex global systems experience a Bronze Age-style collapse, there might be no isolated regions to preserve knowledge and eventually rebuild. The next collapse might be total. The Bronze Age titans left us clues about how to recognize the warning signs of civilizational breakdown. They showed us how complex societies become vulnerable to cascading failures. They demonstrated the importance of maintaining resilient local systems alongside global networks. They revealed how crucial it is to preserve diverse forms of knowledge and social organization. But most importantly, they left us a question that becomes more urgent with each passing year. Are we wise enough to learn from their mistakes, or are we destined to repeat them on a scale that would make the Bronze Age collapse look like a minor historical footnote? The archaeological evidence suggests that many Bronze Age societies had the knowledge and capability to avoid collapse if they had acted soon enough. They understood the warning signs, They had the technology to implement solutions. They possessed the social institutions necessary for coordinated responses. What they lacked was the collective will to make difficult changes before crisis forced change upon them. They chose to maintain familiar patterns of behavior even when those patterns were clearly leading toward disaster. They prioritized short-term stability over long-term sustainability. They hoped that somehow, through luck or divine intervention or technological innovation, their problems would solve themselves without requiring fundamental changes to how their societies operated. The ruins they left behind stand as monuments to the consequences of that choice. And as we face our own mounting challenges, climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, technological disruption, we must ask ourselves whether we have the wisdom to choose differently. The mystery of the vanished Bronze Age Titans isn't really about what happened 3,000 years ago. It's about what's happening now, in our time, in our civilization. It's about whether we can break the cycle of rise and fall that has characterized human societies throughout history, or whether we're doomed to become the next great mystery for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The Titans fell because they couldn't imagine a world different from the one they had built. They couldn't conceive of alternatives to the systems that had made them great, even when those systems were clearly failing them. They held on to complexity, even when complexity had become their greatest vulnerability. We still have time to make different choices. We can still learn from their example, recognize the warning signs they missed, and begin the difficult work of building more resilient forms of civilization. But that window of opportunity won't remain open forever. The Bronze Age Titans waited too long. The question that haunts us across the millennia is simple. Will we be any wiser, or will future generations walk through the ruins of our cities, wondering how we could have had so much and lost it all so completely? The answer lies not in the distant past, but in the choices we make today. The Titans are gone, but their greatest lesson remains. Civilizations don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they're too strong to bend, too rigid to adapt, too complex to change course before it's too late. Time will tell whether we've learned that lesson or whether we're destined to join them in the archaeological record as another cautionary tale about the rise and fall of human ambition. The silence that followed the Bronze Age collapse wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of memory itself. In the centuries after the great civilizations fell, something extraordinary happened that makes their disappearance even more mysterious. The people who survived, who lived in the shadow of abandoned palaces and empty cities, began to forget not just how these monuments had been built, but that they had ever been built by human hands at all. Walk through the ruins of Mycenae today, and you'll see what the later Greeks saw when they encountered these massive stone walls. Blocks of limestone so enormous, fitted together with such precision, that it seemed impossible for mortal men to have moved them. The Greeks had a name for this type of construction: Cyclopean masonry, named after the one-eyed giants of their mythology. They literally believed that only supernatural beings could have created what their Bronze Age predecessors had accomplished through engineering and organization. This wasn't ignorance. It was a kind of cultural amnesia so complete that it transformed history into myth. The later Greeks remembered the Trojan War, but they remembered it as a tale of gods and heroes, not as a conflict between Bronze Age kingdoms. They preserved stories of great kings and mighty fortresses, but they had lost all practical knowledge of how Bronze Age societies actually functioned. The same pattern emerged across the former Bronze Age world. In India, magnificent Harappan cities became the stuff of legend, transformed into mythical kingdoms inhabited by divine beings. In Turkey, the ruins of Hittite cities were attributed to vanished races of giants or demons. In Europe, Bronze Age monuments became fairy rings, dragons' lairs, places where the old gods had once walked the earth. This transformation of history into mythology reveals something profound about the nature of civilizational collapse. It wasn't just that complex technologies were lost, It was that the very concept of such complexity became unimaginable to the people who came after. The survivors couldn't conceive of human societies sophisticated enough to build what they saw in ruins around them, so they invented supernatural explanations instead. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this cultural amnesia is how quickly it occurred. Within just 2 or 3 generations after the collapse, detailed knowledge of Bronze Age achievements had vanished. Within a few centuries, even the memory that such knowledge had once existed was gone. Entire civilizations had been erased, not just from the landscape, but from human consciousness. This rapid forgetting suggests that Bronze Age societies had developed forms of knowledge storage that were more fragile than we might expect. They had writing systems, but these were often restricted to small groups of specialists. They had educational institutions, but these were closely tied to palace bureaucracies that vanished when the palaces fell. They had professional guilds and craft traditions, but these depended on continuous practice and transmission that was disrupted by social chaos. When these formal systems of knowledge preservation collapsed, there were apparently no backup mechanisms to maintain the information they contained. Unlike societies that relied primarily on oral tradition, which can be remarkably durable because it's distributed across entire populations, Bronze Age civilizations had concentrated crucial knowledge in institutions and specialists who proved vulnerable to disruption. The result was a kind of intellectual dark age that lasted for centuries. Not because people became less intelligent or less capable, but because the accumulated wisdom of previous generations had been lost. Each new society had to rediscover, through trial and error, techniques and principles that had once been common knowledge. This pattern of knowledge loss and rediscovery has profound implications for understanding the true scale of what we lost during the Bronze Age collapse. We tend to focus on the physical destruction, the burned palaces, the abandoned cities, the broken pottery. But the intellectual destruction may have been even more significant. Entire libraries of human knowledge vanished without leaving any trace except in the technologies and achievements we can observe archaeologically. Consider what this means for our understanding of Bronze Age capabilities. The monuments and artifacts they left behind represent only what we can still see and study. But these physical remains may represent just a fraction of what these civilizations actually knew and could do. The knowledge that was preserved only in writing, only in oral traditions, only in the memories of specialists, all of that is gone forever. We know that Bronze Age societies could work bronze with extraordinary skill because we have their artifacts. We know they could build massive stone structures because we have their monuments. We know they could navigate long distances because we have evidence of their trade networks. But what about the knowledge that left no physical trace? Their understanding of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy. Their techniques for organization, negotiation, conflict resolution. Their methods for maintaining social cohesion across diverse populations. All of this softer knowledge, the wisdom that might have been their greatest achievement, vanished in the collapse, leaving behind only tantalizing hints in the archaeological record. We can see that these were sophisticated societies, but we can only guess at the full extent of their sophistication. This realization adds another dimension to the mystery of the Bronze Age collapse. We're not just trying to understand what destroyed these civilizations, we're trying to understand what we lost when they fell. And because so much of what was lost left no physical evidence, we may never fully comprehend the magnitude of that loss. But the pattern of forgetting that followed the Bronze Age collapse also offers insights into how knowledge is preserved and transmitted across generations. The societies that survived the collapse most successfully weren't necessarily the ones with the most advanced technologies or the most complex institutions. They were the ones with the most robust methods for preserving and transmitting essential knowledge through periods of disruption. Egypt survived partly because its writing system and educational institutions were more widely distributed than those of other Bronze Age societies. Mesopotamian civilizations endured because they had developed redundant systems for preserving information, multiple copies of important texts, schools in different cities, diverse groups of scribes and scholars. Some European societies maintained continuity by embedding crucial knowledge in oral traditions, religious practices, and craft skills that could survive even when formal institutions collapsed. The lesson for modern societies is clear. The sophistication of our knowledge systems means nothing if they're vulnerable to cascading failures. We've created vast repositories of information, libraries, databases, educational institutions, research centers. But how robust are these systems against the kinds of disruptions that brought down the Bronze Age world? Modern information storage is simultaneously more durable and more fragile than anything Bronze Age societies possessed. Digital storage can preserve vast amounts of information indefinitely, but it depends on complex technological infrastructures that could be vulnerable to the same kinds of system-wide failures that destroyed Bronze Age civilizations. We can transmit knowledge around the world in seconds, but this same interconnectedness means that disruptions can spread globally with unprecedented speed. Perhaps most troubling, modern societies have become even more specialized than their Bronze Age counterparts. The knowledge needed to maintain our technological civilization is distributed among millions of specialists, each understanding only a small piece of the whole. If the institutions that coordinate these specialists were to fail, if the systems that preserve and transmit specialized knowledge were to collapse, would we face the same kind of rapid forgetting that followed the Bronze Age collapse? The archaeological evidence suggests that we might. When complex systems fail, they often fail quickly and completely. The gradual erosion of knowledge that followed the Bronze Age collapse might actually represent a best-case scenario, where some information was preserved and some continuity maintained. In a more catastrophic collapse, the forgetting could be even more rapid and complete. This possibility gives new urgency to questions about how we preserve and transmit knowledge in modern societies. Are we building robust systems that can survive disruption? Or are we creating elegant but fragile networks that could vanish as completely as Bronze Age palaces? Are we distributing crucial knowledge widely enough that it can survive institutional failures? Or are we concentrating it in vulnerable specialist communities? The Bronze Age titans had centuries to develop their sophisticated knowledge systems, and those systems vanished almost overnight when the supporting social structures collapsed. We've built even more sophisticated systems in just a few decades. The question is whether they're any more resilient than what came before. The forgetting that followed the Bronze Age collapse wasn't just an unfortunate side effect of social disruption, it was an integral part of the collapse process itself. When people lost the knowledge needed to maintain complex systems, those systems became impossible to rebuild. When they forgot how their ancestors had solved fundamental problems, they had to start over from scratch, often with less favorable conditions and fewer resources. This creates a feedback loop where collapse begets more collapse, where the loss of knowledge makes recovery more difficult, which leads to further loss of knowledge. Breaking out of this cycle requires not just preserving information, but preserving the social systems and cultural practices that make knowledge usable. The Bronze Age titans understood this, at least partially. They built redundant systems, maintained multiple copies of important information, distributed knowledge across different institutions and regions. But their backup systems proved insufficient when faced with synchronized failures across their entire network of civilization. We face the same challenge today, but on a much larger scale. Our global civilization is more complex, more interconnected, and potentially more vulnerable than anything the Bronze Age world achieved. The knowledge we need to preserve is vastly greater and more specialized. The systems we depend on are more intricate and more fragile. Yet we also have advantages the Bronze Age titans lacked. We understand more about how complex systems fail and how knowledge is lost. We have technologies for preserving and distributing information that they couldn't have imagined. We have the example of their collapse to learn from. The question is whether we'll use these advantages to build more resilient systems, or whether we'll follow the same path that led to their downfall. The Bronze Age titans created magnificent civilizations that seemed destined to endure forever. Then they vanish so completely that for centuries, people forgot they had ever existed. As we stand at our own crossroads, facing our own systemic challenges, the silence that followed their collapse echoes like a warning across 3 millennia. It reminds us that forgetting is not just a personal experience, but a civilizational one. Entire societies can lose their memory, their knowledge, their understanding of what's possible. The Titans are gone, but their silence still speaks to us. It asks whether we're building systems that can preserve human knowledge through the inevitable crises that complex societies must face. It challenges us to create forms of civilization that are not just sophisticated, but resilient. It warns us that the price of fragile complexity may be not just collapse, but the kind of complete forgetting that makes recovery impossible. In the end, the greatest mystery of the Bronze Age collapse may not be what destroyed these civilizations, but how completely they were erased from human memory. Their ruins stand as monuments, not just to what was lost, but to how quickly and thoroughly loss can occur. The silence they left behind is perhaps their most important legacy. A reminder that civilizations don't just fall. They can disappear so completely that future generations won't even remember they existed. Unless we learn from their example, unless we build better systems for preserving what we've achieved, we might join them in that silence, leaving behind only ruins for future archaeologists to puzzle over, and myths for future storytellers to embellish. The Bronze Age Titans thought they were building for eternity. In the end, they barely managed to leave whispers. The question that haunts us across the centuries is whether we can do better, whether we can create forms of human knowledge and organization that are robust enough to survive whatever storms the future might bring. Time will tell if we've learned from their silence, or if we're destined to join them in the archaeological record as another civilization that achieved greatness and then vanished without a trace, leaving future generations to wonder how we could have had so much and remembered so little. The weight of this realization becomes even more crushing when we consider the sheer randomness of what survived and what didn't. Walking through the British Museum or the Louvre today, you're not seeing the crown jewels of Bronze Age achievement. You're seeing the accidents, the fragments that happened to escape destruction through pure chance. A pottery shard that fell into a well, a bronze dagger buried with a forgotten warrior, a clay tablet that happened to be fired hard enough by the flames that consumed the library around it. These random survivors have become the foundation for everything we think we know about Bronze Age civilizations. But they represent such a tiny fraction of what once existed that building theories around them is like trying to understand a symphony by listening to a few scattered notes played out of sequence. We're archaeologists working with the debris of forgetting, trying to reconstruct entire worlds from their unintentional leftovers. Consider the tragic irony embedded in this process. The Bronze Age societies that invested most heavily in preserving their knowledge, the ones with the most extensive libraries, the most sophisticated writing systems, the most elaborate record-keeping bureaucracies, these are often the civilizations about which we know the least. Their very sophistication made their knowledge more fragile, more dependent on institutions and specialists that vanished when their societies collapsed. Meanwhile, the societies that left behind the most durable traces were often the ones that embedded their knowledge in stone, metal, and pottery, rather than in writing. The megalithic builders of Western Europe, who raised massive stone circles and burial chambers, created monuments that have survived when entire libraries have turned to dust. But these monuments speak in a language we can barely understand, telling us about astronomical alignments and ritual practices, while remaining silent about the daily lives and thoughts of the people who built them. This creates a distorted picture of Bronze Age achievement. We know more about their monumental architecture than their literature, more about their metalworking than their mathematics, more about their burial practices than their living arrangements. The knowledge that survived was not necessarily the knowledge that was most important to these societies. It was simply the knowledge that was most resistant to destruction and forgetting. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this selective preservation is how it might be affecting our own civilization. We've become so dependent on digital storage systems that we may be creating an even more fragile form of cultural memory than anything the Bronze Age world possessed. Electronic information can be copied perfectly and transmitted instantly, but it can also be erased completely without leaving any physical trace. A Bronze Age clay tablet, even when broken, leaves fragments that can be pieced together. A digital file, when corrupted or deleted, simply ceases to exist. We're creating vast repositories of human knowledge that exist only as patterns of magnetic fields or electrical charges, patterns that could vanish in an instant if the systems maintaining them were to fail. Already, we're experiencing what digital archivists call bit rot, the gradual degradation of electronic information over time. Files created just decades ago are becoming unreadable as the software and hardware needed to access them becomes obsolete. Websites disappear, databases crash, servers fail, taking with them entire categories of contemporary knowledge and experience. Future archaeologists studying our civilization might face the opposite problem from those studying the Bronze Age. Instead of too little information, they might have too much, vast quantities of digital debris that they lack the tools to interpret or organize. They might find our hard drives and servers, but without the passwords, the software, the context needed to make sense of what they contain. These repositories of knowledge might be as mysterious as Bronze Age ruins. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us that the medium of knowledge storage matters as much as the knowledge itself. Information preserved in human memory can survive institutional collapse, but it's vulnerable to gradual distortion over generations. Information preserved in writing can maintain accuracy over time, but it depends on continuous literacy and institutional support. Information preserved in physical artifacts can endure for millennia, but it may become increasingly difficult to interpret as cultural context is lost. Digital information combines some of the advantages of these earlier forms. It can be copied without loss, transmitted across vast distances, and organized in sophisticated ways. But it also combines their vulnerabilities. Like human memory, it depends on continuous attention and active maintenance. Like writing, it requires specialized knowledge to access and interpret. Like physical artifacts, it can become mysterious as the technologies needed to understand it become obsolete. We're conducting a vast experiment in a cultural memory, storing increasing amounts of human knowledge in forms that have never been tested over historical timescales. The Bronze Age Titans conducted a similar experiment with their own information technologies, and the results were catastrophic. When their complex systems of knowledge storage and transmission failed, entire civilizations lost the ability to understand their own achievements. The parallels are unsettling because they suggest that we might be vulnerable to the same kinds of cascading information failures that contributed to the Bronze Age collapse. Our global knowledge networks are more sophisticated than anything previous civilizations achieved, but they're also more complex and potentially more fragile. They depend on electrical power, telecommunications infrastructure, and specialized technical knowledge that could all be disrupted by the kinds of systemic crises that brought down Bronze Age societies. But there's another dimension to this problem that the Bronze Age experience illuminates. It's not just that we might lose access to stored information, it's that we might lose the cultural frameworks needed to make sense of that information. Knowledge isn't just data, it's data plus context, interpretation, and understanding. When the Bronze Age civilizations collapsed, they lost not just their libraries, but the educational systems, cultural traditions, and intellectual communities that gave meaning to what those libraries contained. Today, we face a similar risk of decontextualization. Our information systems can store vast amounts of raw data, but the expertise needed to interpret that data is often concentrated in small communities of specialists. If those communities were disrupted, If the institutions that train and support them were to fail, we might find ourselves in possession of enormous amounts of information, but lacking the knowledge needed to understand what it means. This is already happening in some fields. Ancient crafts and traditional knowledge systems are disappearing as the communities that maintain them are disrupted by modernization. Languages die out, taking with them entire ways of understanding and organizing human experience. Cultural practices that once preserved crucial information about everything from agriculture to astronomy are abandoned as irrelevant to contemporary life. We're experiencing our own form of cultural amnesia, but it's happening gradually and selectively, rather than through dramatic collapse. We're not losing everything at once, as the Bronze Age societies did, but we're losing pieces continuously. Skills, stories, ways of thinking that took centuries to develop and might take centuries to rediscover. The Bronze Age collapse offers a warning about where this process might lead. Those civilizations didn't lose their knowledge overnight either. Archaeological evidence suggests that the collapse unfolded over several generations, with different aspects of Bronze Age society failing at different rates. First, long-distance trade became unreliable. Then, specialized crafts began to disappear. Administrative systems broke down. Writing fell out of use. Finally, even the memory of how these systems had once functioned was lost. We might be witnessing the early stages of a similar process. Global supply chains are becoming more fragile. Specialized knowledge is becoming more concentrated and vulnerable. Educational systems are struggling to keep pace with technological change. Cultural institutions are losing their ability to preserve and transmit traditional knowledge. None of these trends by themselves is catastrophic, but together they might be creating conditions similar to those that preceded the Bronze Age collapse. We're building a civilization that depends on increasingly complex and specialized knowledge, while simultaneously weakening the social and cultural systems that preserve and transmit that knowledge. The Bronze Age Titans faced this same contradiction. They created magnificent achievements that required sophisticated knowledge to maintain, but they concentrated that knowledge in vulnerable institutions and specialist communities. When those institutions failed and those communities scattered, even the memory of what had been achieved was lost. We still have time to learn from their example, to build more robust systems for preserving and transmitting human knowledge. But that requires recognizing that information technology alone is not enough. We need social technologies, cultural practices, and educational systems that can maintain continuity even through periods of disruption and change. The silence that followed the Bronze Age collapse wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of understanding, the loss of the frameworks that give human experience meaning and continuity. That silence lasted for centuries, and in some ways, it continues today. There are still voices from the Bronze Age world that we cannot hear, stories that we cannot read, knowledge that we cannot recover. As we face our own uncertain future, the question becomes, what are we doing to ensure that our voices will still be heard, that our stories will still be readable, that our knowledge will still be recoverable by future generations? The Bronze Age Titans thought they were building for eternity, but they built on foundations of forgetting. The challenge for our civilization is to build on foundations of remembering, to create forms of cultural memory that are robust enough to survive whatever storms may come. The mystery of the vanished Bronze Age Titans isn't just about what happened to them. It's about what happens to all human knowledge when the systems that preserve it fail. Their collapse teaches us that civilizations don't just lose their power or their wealth when they fall. They lose their memory, their understanding, their very sense of what's possible. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson the Bronze Age Titans left behind. Not a warning about climate change or invasions or economic collapse, but a reminder about the fragility of human memory itself. They showed us that even the greatest achievements can be forgotten, that even the most sophisticated knowledge can be lost, that even the most powerful civilizations can vanish so completely that future generations won't even know they existed. The silence they left behind echoes across 3 millennia, asking us a question that becomes more urgent with each passing day. What will we do to ensure that our own achievements, our own knowledge, our own voices are not lost to the same forgetting that claimed theirs? The answer to that question may determine not just whether our civilization survives, but whether it will be remembered if it doesn't. The more we study these vanished civilizations, the more we realize that their collapse wasn't just about the loss of buildings or trade routes. It was about the breakdown of something far more fundamental: the invisible networks of trust, cooperation, and shared understanding that held these societies together. These weren't just economic or political systems, they were vast social organisms that had evolved over centuries, each component dependent on countless others, in ways that even their creators probably didn't fully comprehend. Think about what it actually meant to be a Bronze Age ruler trying to govern a complex kingdom. You couldn't just issue orders and expect them to be followed. Every command had to travel through layers of intermediaries: palace administrators, provincial governors, local chiefs, scribes, messengers. Each link in this chain had to understand not just what you wanted, but why you wanted it, how it fit into the larger scheme of governance, what resources would be needed to accomplish it. This required a shared language that went far beyond words. It required common assumptions about how the world worked, about what was important, about how people should behave in different circumstances. It required trust that information would flow accurately up and down the hierarchy, that promises would be kept, that roles and responsibilities would be honored even when no one was watching. Archaeological evidence suggests that Bronze Age societies had developed remarkably sophisticated systems for maintaining this social cohesion across vast distances and diverse populations. They created standardized weights and measures that allowed merchants from different regions to trade fairly. They established diplomatic protocols that allowed kings to negotiate without triggering wars. They developed religious and cultural practices that gave people from different backgrounds a sense of shared identity and purpose. But these same systems that enabled unprecedented cooperation also created unprecedented vulnerabilities. When trust broke down, when shared assumptions no longer held, when the invisible bonds that held society together began to fray, the collapse could be swift and total. Unlike simpler societies where most people knew how to provide for their basic needs independently, Bronze Age civilizations had created populations that were completely dependent on the smooth functioning of complex social and economic networks. The archaeological record shows us what happened when those networks failed. Suddenly, farmers couldn't get the metal tools they needed to work their fields effectively. Craftsmen couldn't obtain the raw materials for their specialized products. Merchants couldn't maintain the trade relationships that had sustained their livelihoods for generations. Administrators couldn't collect the taxes or tribute that funded government operations. Soldiers couldn't be equipped or provisioned for military campaigns. Each of these failures created pressure on other parts of the system. Food shortages led to social unrest. Economic disruption triggered political instability. Military weakness invited external threats. Administrative breakdown made coordinated responses impossible. What had once been a virtuous cycle of prosperity and growth became a vicious cycle of decline and collapse. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from sites where archaeologists have found clear signs that people saw the collapse coming and tried to prepare for it. In some Bronze Age settlements, they've discovered large hidden caches of valuable goods: bronze weapons, precious metals, carved ornaments, buried in locations that suggest their owners intended to return for them later. These weren't random acts of desperation. They were calculated attempts to preserve wealth through a period of expected chaos. The fact that these caches were never retrieved tells us something profound about the nature of Bronze Age collapse. The people who buried these treasures weren't just worried about temporary disruptions, invasions that would pass, famines that would end, political upheavals that would eventually stabilize. They were preparing for something they recognized might be permanent, a fundamental breakdown of the social order that had defined their world. This suggests that at least some Bronze Age people understood what was happening to their civilizations. They could see the warning signs, recognize the patterns of decline, anticipate the coming chaos. But understanding the problem and solving it were two very different things. By the time the symptoms of collapse became obvious, the underlying causes may have been too deeply embedded in the structure of society to address without dismantling everything that made that society function. Modern complexity theory offers insights into why this might have been the case. Complex systems often appear stable and robust right up until the moment they collapse catastrophically. This happens because they develop what researchers call hidden fragilities, vulnerabilities that aren't apparent during normal operations but become critical weaknesses when the system faces unusual stress. In Bronze Age societies, these hidden fragilities might have included dependencies on specific trade routes that seemed secure but could be easily disrupted, or reliance on particular types of expertise that seemed common but were actually concentrated in small groups of specialists, or assumptions about political stability that seemed reasonable but were based on temporary circumstances. When multiple stresses hit simultaneously, climate change, invasions, internal conflicts, natural disasters, these hidden fragilities were exposed. Systems that had worked smoothly for centuries suddenly failed in cascading waves that overwhelmed any attempt at repair or adaptation. The very sophistication that had made Bronze Age civilizations great became the source of their vulnerability. This pattern helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the Bronze Age collapse: why it happened when it did, at what seemed to be the peak of these civilizations' power and achievement. From our perspective, looking back across 3 millennia, it seems like these societies should have been strong enough to weather any crisis. They had survived previous challenges, adapted to changing conditions, rebuilt after disasters. But complexity theory suggests that systems often become most vulnerable precisely when they appear most successful. As they grow larger and more sophisticated, they accumulate hidden dependencies and fragilities that aren't tested until conditions change dramatically. The Bronze Age civilizations may have been victims of their own success, growing so complex and interconnected that they became impossible to sustain when external conditions shifted. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Bronze Age collapse sites often show signs of what researchers call complexity reduction, the rapid simplification of social, economic, and technological systems. Instead of gradual adaptation to new circumstances, there was sudden abandonment of complex practices and return to simpler ways of life. This wasn't necessarily because people became less intelligent or capable. It was because maintaining complexity requires continuous investment of energy and resources, and when those become scarce, simplification becomes the only viable survival strategy. People gave up sophisticated technologies not because they forgot how to use them, but because they could no longer afford the social infrastructure needed to support them. The pattern emerges clearly when we compare different regions after the collapse. Areas that had been most heavily urbanized and specialized showed the most dramatic decline. Regions that had maintained more diverse, self-sufficient economies were better able to adapt. The societies that survived were often those that had remained simpler, more locally focused, less dependent on the complex networks that characterized Bronze Age civilization at its height. This creates a paradox that resonates uncomfortably with our contemporary situation. The very advances that make civilizations more powerful and successful also make them more vulnerable to systemic failure. The same interconnectedness that enables unprecedented prosperity also creates pathways for problems to spread rapidly throughout the system. The same specialization that increases efficiency also reduces resilience when specialists become unavailable or when specialized knowledge is lost. We see this pattern playing out in our own time as well. Modern industrial civilization has achieved levels of complexity that would have been unimaginable to Bronze Age peoples. Our global supply chains, financial networks, Technological infrastructures and information systems make Bronze Age trade routes and administrative hierarchies look simple by comparison. Yet this same complexity has created vulnerabilities that we're only beginning to understand. Computer viruses can shut down power grids. Financial panic can spread around the world in hours. Supply chain disruptions can create shortages of essential goods. Social media can amplify political instability and social conflict. Climate change can trigger cascading failures across multiple interconnected systems simultaneously. The Bronze Age experience suggests that these aren't just temporary challenges that can be solved through better management or new technologies. They may be inherent features of complex systems, vulnerabilities that increase as sophistication grows. If this is true, then the question isn't whether our civilization will face its own version of Bronze Age collapse, but when and how severe it will be. But the Bronze Age collapse also offers reasons for cautious optimism. While many civilizations fell, human knowledge and capability weren't lost forever. The collapse cleared away systems that had become unsustainable and created opportunities for innovation and experimentation. The societies that emerged from the chaos often developed new forms of organization that were more resilient than what came before. The Greeks created political systems that distributed power more widely. The Romans built administrative structures that were more flexible and adaptive. Later civilizations learned to preserve knowledge in more durable forms and to maintain continuity through periods of disruption and change. Each cycle of collapse and renewal taught humanity something about how to build more sustainable forms of complex society. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Bronze Age Titans. Their collapse wasn't just a tragedy, it was also a learning experience, a test of human adaptability that taught our species crucial lessons about the limits of complexity and the importance of resilience. The societies that learned from their example were better prepared for future challenges. The ones that ignored the warning signs repeated their mistakes. Today, we have access to this accumulated wisdom about civilizational rise and fall. We can study the patterns, understand the vulnerabilities, recognize the warning signs. We can design systems that are not just efficient and sophisticated, but also robust and adaptable. We can learn to manage complexity in ways that preserve its benefits while minimizing its risks. But this requires acknowledging that complexity itself isn't always progress, that growth isn't always improvement, that efficiency isn't always worth the loss of resilience it might require. The Bronze Age Titans fell because they couldn't imagine alternatives to the systems that had made them great. They held on to complexity, even when it became a burden rather than a benefit. We face the same choice they did. Adapt our systems to changing conditions, or wait for changing conditions to adapt our systems for us. The Bronze Age collapse shows us what happens when that choice is delayed too long. The question that echoes across 3 millennia is whether we have the wisdom to choose differently, or whether we're destined to join the Titans in the archaeological record as another civilization that achieved greatness and then lost it to the very complexity that had made it possible. The ruins of Bronze Age cities stand as monuments not just to human achievement, but to human hubris, the belief that what we build will last forever, that growth can continue indefinitely, that complexity can be managed without consequence. Their silence reminds us that civilizations, like all complex systems, have life cycles. They grow, they flourish, they face challenges, and eventually they transform or collapse. The choice we face isn't whether this cycle will continue, it's how we'll participate in it. Will we be active agents in our civilization's adaptation and transformation, or passive victims of forces we refuse to acknowledge until it was too late? The Bronze Age Titans made their choice. Now it's time for us to make ours. The mystery of their vanishing may never be completely solved, but its lessons grow clearer with each passing year. In a world of increasing complexity and interconnection, their story isn't ancient history. It's a preview of our own potential future. How we respond to that preview will determine whether our civilization learns from the past or repeats it, whether we break the cycle of rise and fall or become its next illustration. The Titans are gone, but their warning remains. In the ruins they left behind, in the silence that followed their fall, in the questions that still echo across the centuries, they left us a message about the price of complexity and the fragility of the systems we build. Whether we heed that message or ignore it will shape not just our future, but the future of human civilization itself. The echoes of Bronze Age collapse grow more haunting when we realize that the forces which brought down these ancient titans may not have been external catastrophes at all, but something far more insidious: the gradual erosion of the very foundations upon which complex societies stand. Recent archaeological discoveries have begun to paint a picture not of sudden destruction, but of slow-motion disintegration that unfolded over generations, so gradually that those living through it might not have fully grasped what was happening until it was far too late to reverse. In the final layers of Bronze Age settlements across Europe and the Mediterranean, archaeologists have found something deeply unsettling: evidence that these societies didn't just collapse, they began cannibalizing themselves, not literally, but systemically. As resources became scarce and external pressures mounted, Bronze Age civilizations started dismantling their own infrastructure to survive in the short term, unknowingly destroying the very systems that had made their survival possible in the first place. At Pylos, the great Mycenaean palace complex, the final occupation layers reveal a strange pattern. Bronze objects that had been carefully crafted and maintained for generations were suddenly being melted down and recast into simpler, cruder forms. Elaborate ceremonial vessels became basic tools. Decorative weapons were transformed into agricultural implements. It's as if the society was consuming its own cultural heritage, trading beauty and sophistication for immediate utility. This wasn't the behavior of a civilization at its peak. This was the desperate improvisation of a society that had begun to realize, perhaps unconsciously, that the complex systems it had built were no longer sustainable. They were stripping copper from temple decorations to make cooking pots, breaking up bronze mirrors to forge arrowheads, melting down ceremonial objects to create the basic tools needed for survival. The pattern appears across dozens of Bronze Age sites, but it's most clearly visible in the archaeological record of what researchers now call the scavenging phase, the period just before final abandonment, when inhabitants began systematically dismantling their own built environment. Stone blocks were pulled from palace walls to build simpler structures. Elaborate drainage systems were broken up, their carefully fitted stones repurposed for basic construction. Even the roads that had once connected these great centers were being torn up, their paving stones hauled away for local building projects. This systematic self-destruction reveals something profound about how complex civilizations die. They don't usually fall to external enemies or natural disasters, though these can certainly deliver the final blow. Instead, they slowly eat themselves alive, sacrificing long-term sustainability for short-term survival until there's nothing left to sacrifice. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this process is how rational it must have seemed to the people making these decisions. When faced with immediate crises, crop failures, trade disruptions, military threats, the logical response was to use whatever resources were available to address the problem at hand. If that meant melting down ceremonial bronze to make weapons, so be it. If it meant tearing up roads to build defensive walls, that was the price of security. If it meant abandoning elaborate rituals and complex administrative systems that consumed valuable resources, then simplification was simply practical. Each individual decision made perfect sense in isolation, but collectively, they were destroying the infrastructure of complexity that had made Bronze Age civilization possible in the first place. It's as if a modern city, facing budget constraints, decided to save money by tearing up its subway system and selling the metal for scrap. The immediate financial benefit might solve short-term problems, but the long-term cost would be the destruction of the transportation network, that made the city function as an economic unit. This pattern of self-cannibalization helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of Bronze Age collapse: why these civilizations didn't gradually decline over centuries, as we might expect from normal historical processes. Instead, they often seem to have functioned normally right up until the moment they suddenly stopped functioning at all. The archaeological record shows sophisticated palace administrations maintaining detailed records, complex trade relationships continuing to operate, elaborate construction projects being completed, and then, within a generation or two, complete abandonment. What happened was that these societies had been consuming their own structural foundations for decades before the collapse became visible. By the time the problems were obvious enough to demand radical solutions, the capacity for implementing those solutions had already been fatally compromised. It was like discovering that your house was on fire only after you'd already torn out the plumbing and electrical systems to pay for other repairs. Modern complexity theory has a term for this phenomenon: coping mechanisms that make the problem worse. When complex systems face stress, their natural response is often to sacrifice resilience for efficiency, to reduce redundancy in order to maintain performance. But this very adaptation makes them more vulnerable to the next crisis, creating a downward spiral where each solution creates new problems that require even more desperate solutions. Bronze Age civilizations may have been caught in exactly this kind of spiral. Climate change forced them to intensify agriculture, which depleted soils and made them more vulnerable to future climate stress. Trade disruptions forced them to become more dependent on local resources, which made them less able to cope with local shortages. Military threats forced them to divert resources from infrastructure maintenance, which made their systems more fragile and prone to failure. Each adaptation was rational in the short term, but collectively they were eroding the foundations of the system they were trying to preserve. And because these changes happened gradually, spread out over decades or even centuries, they may not have been recognized as symptoms of a larger systemic problem until it was too late to reverse course. This gradual self-destruction helps explain another puzzling feature of Bronze Age collapse sites: the absence of clear enemy action in many cases. If these civilizations had been conquered by external forces, we would expect to find evidence of battles, siege warfare, deliberate destruction. Instead, many sites show signs of careful dismantling, as if the inhabitants themselves had taken apart their own cities, piece by piece, before finally walking away. In some cases, this dismantling was so thorough that it suggests planning and coordination. Valuable materials were carefully removed and presumably taken elsewhere. Useful stone blocks were extracted and repurposed. Even the metal fittings from doors and windows were salvaged. This wasn't the frantic scavenging that might follow a military defeat. It was the methodical deconstruction of a society that had decided its current form was no longer viable. But where did all these materials go? And more importantly, where did all these people go? The archaeological record suggests that in many cases, they didn't go far. Instead of mass migration to distant lands, the evidence points toward local dispersal into smaller, simpler communities scattered across the same general regions, where the great Bronze Age centers had once flourished. This pattern of complexity collapse, rather than population collapse, suggests that Bronze Age societies didn't die out. They simplified. People who had lived in cities of tens of thousands returned to villages of hundreds or dozens. Specialists who had spent their entire lives mastering narrow crafts became generalists who could perform multiple functions. Administrative hierarchies that had coordinated activities across vast territories were replaced by local decision-making based on personal relationships and immediate needs. From one perspective, this looks like regression, a fall from sophisticated civilization back to primitive simplicity. But from another perspective, it might represent successful adaptation to changing circumstances. If the complex systems of Bronze Age civilization had become unsustainable, then simplification wasn't failure, it was survival. Archaeological evidence supports this more optimistic interpretation. Post-collapse communities often show innovations and improvements that suggest they weren't just struggling survivors, but people actively adapting to new conditions. They developed new techniques for working iron that eventually proved superior to bronze. They created more efficient agricultural methods suited to smaller-scale farming. They established trade relationships that were more flexible and resilient than the rigid palace-controlled networks they replaced. Perhaps most significantly, they developed new forms of social organization that distributed power and knowledge more widely throughout the community. Instead of depending on small groups of specialists and administrators, post-collapse societies often show evidence of more egalitarian structures where important skills and knowledge were shared among larger portions of the population. This broader distribution of knowledge and capability may have made these simpler societies more resilient than their Bronze Age predecessors. When a Bronze Age palace fell, it often took with it the administrative knowledge, craft skills, and cultural memory that had been concentrated within its walls. But when post-collapse communities faced crises, the knowledge and skills needed to respond were more widely distributed, making the society as a whole less vulnerable to catastrophic loss. The irony is profound. The very simplicity that we might interpret as evidence of civilizational failure may actually have been a more sustainable approach to organizing human societies. The Bronze Age titans achieved unprecedented heights of sophistication and power, but they did so by creating systems that were ultimately too complex and fragile to maintain. Their successors achieved less spectacular heights, but they built societies that could adapt and endure through changing circumstances. This realization adds another layer to the mystery of Bronze Age collapse. Perhaps we're asking the wrong question when we wonder what destroyed these civilizations. Perhaps we should be asking why they chose complexity over sustainability in the first place, and what conditions might cause societies to make that same choice again. The answer might lie in what researchers call the complexity trap. The tendency for successful societies to become addicted to the benefits of complex systems, even when those systems are becoming increasingly difficult and expensive to maintain. Each new level of sophistication brings new capabilities and benefits, but also new dependencies and vulnerabilities. And once a society has organized itself around complex systems, it becomes extremely difficult to voluntarily simplify without appearing to give up everything that made the society successful. Bronze Age elites had invested their entire identities in the complex systems they controlled. Palace administrators derived their power from managing elaborate bureaucracies. Craft specialists gained their status from mastering difficult techniques. Religious leaders maintained their authority through elaborate rituals and ceremonies. For any of these groups to advocate for simplification would have meant advocating for the elimination of their own roles in society. So instead of adapting proactively to changing conditions, Bronze Age societies continued to invest in complexity even when it was becoming counterproductive. They built larger palaces when smaller ones would have been more efficient. They created more elaborate bureaucracies when simpler ones would have been more responsive. They maintained expensive trade relationships when local production would have been more reliable. This institutional inertia, combined with the gradual nature of systemic stress, created conditions where collapse became inevitable before it became obvious. By the time the problems were severe enough to force change, the systems that would have been needed to manage that change had already been fatally weakened. Modern industrial civilization faces remarkably similar dynamics. Our complex global systems provide unprecedented benefits, but they also create dependencies and vulnerabilities that are becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Climate change, resource depletion, technological disruption, and social inequality are creating stresses that our current systems were not designed to handle. Yet, like Bronze Age elites, modern power structures have strong incentives to maintain complexity rather than adapt to changing conditions. Global corporations depend on complex supply chains and financial networks. Government bureaucracies derive their authority from managing elaborate regulatory systems. Academic and professional institutions maintain their relevance through increasing specialization and technical sophistication. The result is a situation where voluntary simplification, reducing dependencies, localizing production, distributing knowledge and capability more widely, might be the most rational response to mounting systemic stresses. But it's also the response that's most threatening to existing power structures and cultural values. We're conducting the same experiments in complexity that the Bronze Age Titans conducted, but on a vastly larger scale and at a much faster pace. Their experiment ended in collapse and simplification, but it also led eventually to new forms of organization that were better adapted to changing conditions. The question for our time is whether we can learn from their example, whether we can choose adaptation and simplification before circumstances choose it for us. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just about what happened 3,000 years ago. It was a preview of the choices that all complex civilizations must eventually face. The Titans made their choice, and they paid the price in collapse and forgetting. Now it's our turn to choose. Will we be wise enough to adapt our systems before they adapt us? Or will we follow the same path that led to their downfall? The ruins they left behind stand as monuments, not just to their achievements, but to their limitations. The inability to change course when change was needed, the preference for familiar complexity over unfamiliar simplicity, the faith that systems that had worked in the past would continue to work in the future. Their silence echoes across 3 millennia with a simple question. When the benefits of complexity no longer outweigh its costs, when the systems that made you great begin to make you vulnerable, when adaptation requires abandoning what you've built in favor of what you need to become, what will you choose? The Bronze Age Titans chose to hold on to complexity until it destroyed them. Their collapse cleared the way for new forms of organization that were simpler but more sustainable. Whether our civilization learns from their example or repeats their mistakes will determine not just our future, but the future of human complexity itself. Time will tell if we have the wisdom to simplify before simplification is forced upon us, or if we're destined to join the Titans in the archaeological record as another civilization that achieved greatness and then lost it to the very sophistication that had made it possible. The weight of this realization settles over us like dust on ancient stones. 3,000 years have passed since the Bronze Age Titans walked the earth, and still their mystery haunts us with questions that cut deeper than any archaeological excavation. We've followed their traces through burned palaces and abandoned cities, through the scattered fragments of their greatest achievements, through the silence that swallowed their voices whole. But perhaps the most unsettling truth isn't what we've discovered about them. It's what we've discovered about ourselves in the process. Every pattern we've uncovered, every vulnerability we've identified, every warning sign we've traced through the archaeological record mirrors something happening in our own time, in our own civilization, in our own choices about complexity and sustainability. The Bronze Age Titans didn't vanish because they were primitive or unlucky. They disappeared because they faced the same fundamental challenge that confronts every complex civilization: how to balance the benefits of sophistication against the risks of fragility, how to maintain the systems that make greatness possible without becoming enslaved by those very systems. They chose complexity over resilience, growth over sustainability, familiar patterns over necessary adaptation, and for a time, those choices seemed to serve them well. Their cities grew larger, their trade networks stretched farther, their technologies became more sophisticated. They built monuments that still inspire awe, created art that still moves us, developed knowledge that took centuries to rediscover. But complexity is a double-edged sword. The same interconnections that enabled unprecedented prosperity also created pathways for cascading failures. The same specialization that produced magnificent achievements also created devastating vulnerabilities. The same sophistication that made them the titans of their age ultimately made them too rigid to bend with changing circumstances. When the stresses mounted, climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, technological disruption, system failures. They couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive. They had built systems so complex that changing them required dismantling everything that made their civilization function. So they held on, desperately trying to maintain what they had built, until the very act of maintenance consumed the resources needed for survival. The archaeological record shows us the result. Not dramatic conquest by external enemies, but slow-motion self-destruction as societies cannibalized their own infrastructure to buy time they couldn't ultimately afford. They melted down their ceremonial bronze to make basic tools. They tore up their roads to build defensive walls. They abandoned their most sophisticated achievements in favor of simple survival. And in the end, even that wasn't enough. The complexity they had created required continuous investment to maintain, and when the resources for that investment disappeared, so did the civilization itself. Within generations, people forgot how to read the scripts their ancestors had used, how to work the metals they had mastered, how to build the monuments they had raised. The knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate vanished in decades. Today, we stand at a similar crossroads. Our global civilization has achieved levels of complexity that would astound Bronze Age observers. We've built systems that span continents, technologies that seem like magic, knowledge networks that connect every corner of the world. We've created unprecedented prosperity, extended human lifespans, and developed capabilities that push the boundaries of what seems possible. But we've also created unprecedented vulnerabilities. Our supply chains stretch across oceans, dependent on political stability in dozens of countries. Our technologies require rare materials controlled by distant corporations. Our financial systems can transmit crisis around the world in minutes. Our information networks can spread disruption as quickly as they spread knowledge. The same forces that brought down the Bronze Age titans are at work in our own time. Climate change that threatens the environmental stability our systems depend on. Resource depletion that challenges the material foundations of industrial civilization. Social inequality that strains the political structures holding our societies together. Technological change that accelerates faster than our ability to understand its consequences. Like the Bronze Age rulers who tried to manage these challenges by making their systems even more complex, we're investing enormous resources in sophisticated solutions that may be making our problems worse. We're building more intricate financial instruments instead of simplifying economic relationships. We're creating more complex technologies instead of reducing our dependencies. We're developing more elaborate management systems instead of distributing knowledge and capability more widely. But the Bronze Age collapse teaches us that there comes a point where complexity stops being a solution and starts being the problem itself. When systems become so intricate that they require more energy to maintain than they produce in benefits. When dependencies become so numerous that any disruption can trigger cascading failures. When specialization becomes so extreme that knowledge becomes trapped in vulnerable institutions and communities. The choice facing our civilization is the same one that faced the Bronze Age titans. Adapt our systems to changing conditions, or wait for changing conditions to adapt our systems for us. Voluntary simplification versus involuntary collapse. Conscious evolution versus catastrophic transformation. The difference is that we have their example to learn from. We can see in the archaeological record what happens when complex civilizations refuse to change course until change is forced upon them. We can study the patterns of collapse and recovery, understand the dynamics of complexity and resilience, recognize the warning signs before they become irreversible. But knowledge alone isn't enough. The Bronze Age titans may have understood what was happening to their world, but they couldn't bring themselves to abandon the systems that had made them great. They couldn't imagine alternatives to the complexity they had built their identities around. They couldn't accept that sometimes the price of survival is giving up what made you successful in the first place. The question that echoes across 3 millennia is whether we can do better. Whether we have the wisdom to change course before circumstances force change upon us. Whether we can learn to see simplification not as failure, but as adaptation. Not as regression, but as evolution toward more sustainable forms of organization. The Bronze Age Titans left us more than ruins and artifacts. They left us a mirror that reflects our own potential future, a warning about the price of complexity, and a challenge to build something better than what they achieved. Their collapse wasn't just ancient history, it was a dress rehearsal for challenges we face today. Their silence speaks to us across the centuries with a simple message. Civilizations don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they become too rigid to adapt, too complex to change, too invested in maintaining what they've built to imagine what they need to become. The mystery of the vanished Bronze Age Titans may never be completely solved. But their greatest secret, the secret of how civilizations live and die, has been revealed in the patterns of their rise and fall. It's written in the archaeological record for anyone willing to read it, encoded in the ruins for anyone brave enough to understand its implications. The Titans are gone, but their story continues in every choice we make about complexity and sustainability, growth and resilience, short-term benefits, and long-term survival. They remind us that no civilization is permanent, that all human achievements are temporary, that even the greatest societies can vanish if they lose the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. But they also remind us of human resilience, of our species' remarkable capacity to learn from failure, to rebuild from ruins, to create new forms of organization that surpass even the achievements of the past. The people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse didn't disappear. They simplified, adapted, and eventually laid the foundations for new civilizations that learn from the mistakes of their predecessors. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the Bronze Age mystery. Collapse isn't the end of the story. It's a transformation, an opportunity for renewal, a chance to build something more sustainable than what came before. The Titans fell, but they cleared the way for new forms of human organization that were better adapted to the challenges of their time. Today, as we face our own mounting challenges, we can choose to learn from their example or repeat their mistakes. We can choose adaptation over rigidity, resilience over efficiency, sustainability over growth. We can choose to transform our civilization before circumstances transform it for us. The Bronze Age Titans made their choice and paid the price in collapse and forgetting. Now, it's our turn to choose. The mystery of their disappearance isn't just about what happened to them. It's about what will happen to us. And unlike them, we still have time to write a different ending to the story. The silence they left behind isn't empty. It's full of warnings, wisdom, and hope. If we listen carefully, we might hear in that silence not just the echoes of ancient collapse, but the whispers of future possibility. The Titans are gone, but their greatest gift to humanity may be the knowledge that even the mightiest civilizations can choose to change course before it's too late. Time will tell if we're wise enough to accept that gift, or if we're destined to join them in the archaeological record as another civilization that achieved greatness and then lost it to the very complexity that had made it possible. The choice is ours. The Titans have shown us both paths. Now we must decide which one we'll take.